My God, whom I worship and adore, I bear witness unto thy unity and thy oneness, and acknowledge thy gifts, both in the past and in the present. Thou art the all-bountiful, the overflowing showers, of whose mercy have rained down upon high and low alike, and the splendors of whose grace have been shed over both the obedient and the rebellious. O God of mercy, before whose door the quintessence of mercy hath bowed down, and round the sanctuary of whose cause loving kindness in its inmost spirit hath circled, we beseech thee, entreating thine ancient grace, and seeking thy present favor, that thou mayest have mercy upon all who are the manifestations of the world of being, and deny them not the outpourings of thy grace in thy days. All are but poor and needy, and thou verily art the all-possessing, the all-subduing, the all-powerful. Baha'u'llah.
We're very pleased to have Dr. Dwight Allen, who is a Knight of Baha'u'llah and became a Knight of Baha'u'llah in 1953 when him and his wife were in Greece with the Bananis. Dr. Allen was a professor and director of teacher education at his alma mater, the Stanford Graduate School of Education, from 1959 to 1967. He was Dean of the College of Education, University of Massachusetts Amherst from 1968 to 1975. And in 1978, Dr. Allen became a professor of education and eminent scholar of educational reform at the Old Dominion University in Virginia. He then retired from Old Dominion University in July 2008. And for several years, he has consulted with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to help devise strategies, which he successfully did, to bring better information to smallholder farmers in South Asia and Africa. Dr. Allen, please.
Thank you, Netta. Welcome, everybody. After I agreed to lead this session on social justice, my son introduced me to a pamphlet or booklet published by the Baha'i World Center, but this is a companion piece to the earlier booklet in the same format called The Baha'is. We are all impatient for social justice to come to the United States and to the world. But the process has been very slow and continues to be very slow. One of the main reasons it is slow is because the approaches so far have been embedded in political rather than spiritual realities. This booklet I find to be very stunning. The visual format is very modern and contemporary. And every page is unique. The overall title is A Spiritual Path to Social Justice. I have been on a path, a spiritual path for social justice all my life. God bountifully put my birth in a Baha'i family. My mother became a Baha'i in San Francisco in 1925 when she was studying to be a missionary for the Methodist Church at the Methodist Training School. One of the ministers gave a course on comparative religion, and every week he would introduce a new religion. From Monday to Thursday, he would introduce the religion, and then on Friday, he would say why it was wrong. My mother became very irritated with his Friday lectures, and she started making an independent investigation and visited churches, synagogues, and mosques all over San Francisco. In the course of that investigation, someone suggested that she attend a Baha'i meeting, and she became a Baha'i the first night she was there. The presenter at that meeting later became a hand of the cause. His name was Leroy Ioweth. Well, my mother and father were married in 1930 after she had done her year of service as a barber in Hawaii, where she served on the local spiritual assembly of Honolulu and became very good friends, close friends with Agnes Alexander, who also was a hand of the Baha'i cause and was a regular part of my life as I was growing up. In 1930, my parents were married. My mother was teaching my father about the Baha'i faith, but he did not become a Baha'i until I was 5 years old. And after that time, why, they both were very, very active Baha'i for their entire lifetime. They did many good things during their life, many bad things. But during the last decades of their life, they gave their lives to Baha'u'llah and were Knights of Baha'u'llah for Swaziland. They went to Swaziland during the first year of the Baha'i 10-year crusade in 1954, early 1954. And my father stayed there for 25 years until his death in 1980. My mother for 39 years until her death in 1993. As I grew up, I was very aware that the Baha'i faith was founded on the premise of the unity of the human family, the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of the human family. But in California, where I was raised, the racial inequity that consumed American society was present, but not very visible to a kid growing up in a Baha'i household. It never occurred to me to be friends with someone because of the color of their skin. And it wasn't until I was about 28 years old that I finally understood how virulent racism was in the United States. I was at the Geyserville Baha'i School, and as director of that week's service, we had an evening at a place called Griffith Grove, which was a redwood grove a few miles from the campus of the Geyserville School. And I was leading the singing, and I led the song Dixie. And a good friend of mine by the name of Adrian Reeves, the sister of Wilma Kazemzada, who was my administrative assistant at Stanford, and then came back to the University of Massachusetts and was my administrative assistant for a few years there until she got her doctorate. And then I lost her as an administrative assistant, but she went on to a distinguished academic career and then a distinguished Baha'i career as a Baha'i counselor and one of the representatives to the United Nations for the Baha'i faith from the Baha'i International Community in New York. But I was leading the song Dixie, and Adrian kicked me and said, "Dwight, there are some people who don't like that song." I said, "Why?" It's very pretty. And she made me very much aware of the fact that I was blissfully ignorant about what was going on. And that was the beginning. I was 28 years old, and that was the beginning of my conscious knowledge of racism. And when I became Dean of Education at the University of Massachusetts, my number one priority for the school was to combat institutional racism. And we gave more minority doctorates while I was dean than all the rest of the universities and all the rest of the United States put together. We had about 80 to 100 minority doctorates during my tenure as dean. Now, this booklet on social justice is organized in a very interesting way. It has 8 chapters. The first chapter is on the diversity of the Baha'i community. And one of the things this book does, or this pamphlet does very nicely, is to show what a process social justice and our awareness of social justice is. In the early days, the Baha'i faith is 137 years old in the United States. Let me correct that, 127 years old in the United States. It came to the United States in the World Conference of Religions in Chicago in 1894. And it grew slowly, but steadily, primarily among upper middle class and wealthy urban people from the eastern seaboard. Then in 1912, Abdul Baha, the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith, came to the United States for a visit. And during his visit, he transformed the American Baha'i community. Baha'is know Abdul Baha as the mystery of God because he is a paradox, the perfect man. And it's very interesting that he is a man that is completely known to contemporary history. In other words, his life and actions are very, very well documented. For most of his life, he was a prisoner alongside his father, Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith. First of all, in Iran, where the Baha'i faith was founded, then in Iraq, where Baha'u'llah was banished, and then to Turkey under the Ottoman Empire and the prison fortress of Akka. He was 67 years old when he was finally released from prison and came, first of all, to Europe, to London and Paris, as well as several other places, but his most concentrated efforts were in London and Paris, where his talks were recorded, and they are now part of the Baha'i literature. One of them is called Paris Talks. The other is called Abdul Baha in London. Then in 1912, he came to the United States for 211 days, and he gave a series of talks that are gathered together in books called The Tablets of Abdul Baha. And at the time that Abdul Baha, by the time he left, there were about 20,000 Baha'is in the United States, but they were mostly Abdul Baha'is. They had become Baha'is because of the influence of Abdul Baha, and they didn't really know very much about the Baha'i faith. Baha'i literature at that time was very, very limited. I know that as a child growing up, there were only 2 or 3 or 4 books of Baha'i writings that had been translated by early Baha'is and by the guardian of the Baha'i faith, Abdul Baha's grandson, who at the time of his death in 1921 was appointed to be guardian of the Baha'i faith. And Shoghi Effendi, who had been a student at Oxford, all of a sudden found himself at a very early age leader of the Baha'i faith. And it was his task to develop Baha'i administrative institutions and the entire organization of the Baha'i faith. And in 1930, he became guardian in 1921. In 1937, he felt that the time had come to have a series of formal teaching plans to bring the Baha'i faith to worldwide recognition. And the first 7-year plan, which focused on North America and the Central and South American continent, one of the major objectives of the first 7-year plan was to have a local spiritual assembly established in each of the 48 states of the United States at that time, and some territories, including Alaska. I remember I was at the dockside in 1938, I think it was, when Honor Kempton left to become the first Baha'i in Alaska. And it was very exciting to me as a young boy at that time, about 7 years old, to have correspondence with this woman who had gone to the end of the world. And she sent me a book called Nanook of the North, because she supported herself in Anchorage by establishing a bookstore. And during that first 7-year plan, when Baha'is were very busy making sure the Baha'i faith was well established in each one of the United States and in Central and South America, why, it was a very exciting time. One of the activities of the 7-year plan was to oversee the construction of the first Baha'i Mother Temple of the West, the Baha'i House of Worship in Wilmette, Illinois, that Abdul Baha himself had laid the cornerstone for. And so the exterior of the temple, completing the exterior ornamentation, was one of the goals of the first 7-year plan. And then completing the temple and dedicating it was one of the goals of the second 7-year plan, which finished in 1953. Uh, Now, in those early times in the United States, there were Baha'is of all races, but not very many. The first American Negro Baha'i was a man named Robert Turner. And one of the most prominent early African American Baha'is was a man named Louis Gregory, who had who was in the time of Abdul Baha, and Abdul Baha arranged his marriage to a white woman. And of course, that kind of interracial marriage was illegal in many places in the United States. But they married and had a successful marriage. And Louis Gregory served on the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United States. And later on, after his death, the National Spiritual Assembly established a Baha'i Institute, the Louis Gregory Baha'i Institute in North Carolina. Many of us as Baha'is have been impatient all of our lives for how slow the progress in social justice has been, because of course the great conundrum in American democracy is the fact that the Declaration of Independence proclaims that all men are created equal and are entitled to certain inalienable rights. But at the same time, in the same Constitution, Black Americans or Negro Americans were only, the slaves were only counted as 3/5 of a person. And the episode of slavery dominated American politics until the Civil War, which started in 1861 and lasted till 1865. And during that time, why the southern slave states, not all of them, but most of them, seceded from the Union and attempted to establish a separate nation called the Confederate States of America. Fortunately, spiritual intervention caused the election of a very unlikely and unknown candidate at that time, a man by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln, at the time of his election as president, was not in favor of emancipation. He was preoccupied with trying to hold the country together and trying to address the divisiveness of slavery between North and South. It must be pointed out that the North was not free of prejudice. It was just that the prejudice in the North took a very different path. And instead of slavery, resulted in all kinds of social interdictions that got in the way of any kind of equality or social justice. I'm not doing a very good job of going through this pamphlet. I've been distracted by other anecdotes, but the booklet emphasizes that the Baha'i faith is based on the Word of God, and that the Word of God is unified. There is only one God and one unfolding religion and of God, and one human family. And the destiny of the human family is to become united and create a golden age of spiritual prosperity. But the Baha'i faith has been working toward racial unity since it first arrived in the United States. But the early efforts would not be recognizable as very progressive at this time, because, for example, when Louis Gregory was invited to the homes of some Baha'is in Washington, D.C., the good news was that as a Black man, he was invited to their homes. The bad news was that he was asked to use the back stairs. And the level of racial equality keeps unfolding. When I was a child, the objective of racial equality was tolerance. We were all trying to be tolerant. But if you really think about it, being tolerant means you're putting up with each other, not that you love each other. And then later on, it became blindness to racial difference. Again, not a very great compliment, because it says we aren't going to notice racial characteristics, but if we notice, we probably wouldn't like them. And then the next level was the appreciation of diversity. And the appreciation of diversity is the standard of racial equality as an aspect of social justice. And the appreciation of differences, at the time, we thought this was the end of the line. This was the ultimate level of social justice. But then if you read the words of Abdul Baha, he says that racial justice is when there is not the hint of estrangement between each other. And none of us, even the Baha'is, can claim to have achieved a level of social justice where there is not a hint of estrangement between us. We are still struggling to have the appreciation of diversity. In this booklet, one of the chapters, chapter 7, I believe it is, goes through and lists all the different things that the Baha'i faith has done to fight for the cause of social justice since its inception and since its first arrival in the United States. And in those early days, what we knew as social justice was not very advanced. It was very patronizing, very limited. But compared with the rest of the society, it was advanced. Now, the Baha'i community is very diverse. It celebrates unity and diversity. And again, it's a learning process. And under the guidance of the leadership in the Baha'i faith, an elected body called the Universal House of Justice, they establish the mechanisms for the Baha'i faith's interface with social justice. And they have established something called the Institute process. And this Institute process is a part of the learning process of the Baha'i community on many dimensions, including social justice. But at the present time, that Institute process consists of 4 major activities: devotional gatherings, children's classes, junior youth classes, and study groups for the adults. And those activities continue to evolve and develop. And the specifics of the Baha'i educational process will continue to evolve. At the present time, the major vehicle for Baha'i learning is called the Rui process. The Rui process was developed in Colombia, South America, and disseminated worldwide. The House of Justice supports the Rui process, but points out that it is not the ultimate vehicle of Baha'i learning, is only a temporary placeholder for now. And we use the Rui process as a way to keep the Baha'is all over the world in a coordinated set of learning activities. One of the things that I want to mention before I open it to questions is the central role of the arts in the Baha'i faith. the Baha'i faith equates the participation and development of the arts as equivalent to or a form of worship. More generally, work done in the spirit of service is worship, but specifically the various forms of the visual and performing arts, dance, music, poetry, all of these are applauded as acts of worship when they are based on spiritual principles. Now, there are excesses in the arts, just like there are excesses in all aspects of society. But it's important that the arts are acknowledged as central to the process of the establishment of social justice. And social justice is not just a matter of the technicality of equality, but social justice has to include economic prosperity, access to education, health, housing, and acknowledgement of the importance of a number of Baha'i social principles, including the equality of women and men, universal education, the independent investigation of truth, freedom from prejudice, the spiritual solution to the economic problems of the world. Did I mention universal education? But these principles create the balance in the march toward social justice that ultimately will, as Baha'u'llah says, eliminate the extremes of poverty and wealth in the world. One of the major mechanisms that the Institute process is using at the present time in the Baha'i faith is the advocacy of all kinds of discourse to encourage in-depth conversations on all aspects of social justice. The moving target of social justice and all of its aspects was underlined to me when I became Dean of Education at the University of Massachusetts. I wrote a letter to the House of Justice saying that now I could apply Baha'i education and build a Baha'i education at the University of Massachusetts. And the House of Justice wrote back, Baha'i education is not yet developed. All you can hope to do is to apply some of the principles of Baha'i education as you understand them to develop a new model of education. That was a very humbling experience to receive that letter, which nicely punctured my balloon.
Leighton, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Aloha, Dr. Dwight Allen. I am speaking from Bermuda. You just gave us a dynamic demonstration of your robust mental faculty. Here is a picture of your physical robust when you arrived in Bermuda in the 1970s. I don't know if you can see that, but there you are at the Bermuda International Airport with several Bermudians.
That's beautiful.
that?
Dwight, can you see that?
Yes,
And when you were here, together, we met the Minister of Education, and you spent about 2 hours with him in his office. My question is, you said when you were 28 in about 1958, that the racism was very
no, I was
virulent.
28 in 1958.
Yes, that you became aware of the virulent racial situation in America. If it was then virulent, how would you describe it today?
I would say that on average, it is better, but there have been lots of ups and downs. At the present, we are just trying to bring ourselves out of a tumbling downside.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Do we have any other questions? Please wave or use the raise your hand feature. Or comments. Yeah, I do want to echo what Leighton said. It really was dynamic. It really showed us truly, you know, we've even said this about some of our former presenters, that, you know, just by you even being here, Dr. Allen, just shows not only your dedication and devotion to Baha'u'llah, but your continual study of even just picking up the most recent pamphlet from the Baha'i World Center and feeling the need to talk on it and to educate us. So bravo and thank you for that. I'm going to go to Dalton and then Colette. Please remember to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Greetings, Dwight.
Hi, Dalton.
How are you? Wonderful to see you again for so many years.
Yep.
I wonder if you might, if you think that it would be a fair characterization to say that while things are getting better in many ways in terms of racism in America, we are also experiencing a situation of perhaps the last bit of sunlight on the mountaintop of racial supremacy and white superiority, and they're scared as all get out, and that's why they're jumping up and down this way and causing so much difficulty.
I would agree with that. And I don't think we've seen the last of white supremacy at all, but we're making progress.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Allen. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and walk down a historical memory lane. You mentioned that at one point there was more of a focus on tolerance between the races, and then that became more of a color blindness, if you will. And I'm wondering what you see as the next part of the evolution as to where we are today. I've become very aware in a lot of the racial justice forums that I participate in that I need to really think about the way I speak and the words I use, because as I evolve and understand more, I feel that perhaps I'm not coming across as effectively and as in such a meaningful way that I can be heard by other people the way I intend to be heard and to be able to dialogue. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we can better improve our communication so we understand each other better.
Well, I characterize the third phase of the process as being the appreciation of differences, and then the end point, although there may be more steps between here and the end point, is where we are so unified that there isn't a trace of estrangement between us, that we are consumed by the love of each other. But we're a long way from that.
Mm.
Now, Abdul Baha predicted that in the future, America will lead all nations spiritually as it has been leading them materially, but we certainly aren't anywhere close to that yet. And there are lots of evidences that the basic progress of the American spirit could be totally in jeopardy if we're not careful.
Mm. So what are some of the things we could do to make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, to continue to increase our level of awareness and acknowledge one of the things that I think is very important is that none of us, even as Baha'i, can claim to be free from racism. What I say to people who ask me where I stand on racism, I say, I know I'm racist, but all you have to do is point out to me any racist action, activity, or proclivity, and it will be unacceptable. But I am unaware of many of my prejudices, biases, and weaknesses, as we all are.
Yeah, thank you for that.
But I think it's important for us as Baha'i to acknowledge that we are on a path of learning, that we have not arrived at the objective of social justice. We've just agreed to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was amazing. I'm going to ask one more time if there's any questions or answers. If not, I'm gonna add a spotlight to our lovely Mrs. Erlita O'Neill, because I know Dwight and Erlita know each other from the past, and as I mentioned, they're both Knights of Baha'u'llah. So I think it would be really nice to just have you both give you both a moment to just talk. And let us eavesdrop.
Guys, it's been so many years ago that I started out. It's a big story. I'd rather come on sometime and talk just about that.
No, absolutely.
But it is great to see him again. I haven't seen him in years. And we've gotten a little older. I just turned 99 years old the other day.
99?
99.
Well,
Yeah.
you're 9 years ahead of me. On the 1st of August, I turned 90.
Yeah, Dick and Mary Ann turned 90 shortly ago. You remember Dick, don't you?
Of course,
The Grogers, yes.
Mary Ann is having some dementia problems.
Yes, I speak to them at least once a week. And we've been close friends for years and years. Keep track of one another.
And of course, our family is intertwined with the Grogers in many ways. My father served on Geyserville Maintenance Committee with Ted Groger, and Louise Groger, of course, was a Baha'i pioneer to the Falkland Islands
Yeah.
and other places. And one of their daughters, Roseanne, I took with me to NABI, the Native American Baha'i Institute, in 1986, just before leaving for our third pioneering experience in Botswana. My wife and I had 3 pioneering experiences. The first was to Greece shortly after we were married in 1953. The second was to Lesotho in 1974, 75, 76. And my wife stayed there until 78 when she was on the National Spiritual Assembly of Lesotho and went to the Baha'i International Conference that year. I went to the international conference 4 times, not in 78, not in 68, not in 78 when she went. I went in 68, 73, 83, and 88. 68, 73, and 83, I was on the NSA of the United States. And in 88, I was on the National Spiritual Assembly of Botswana. I think I may hold a world's record because I was elected to the NSA in Botswana 9 days after I arrived in the country.
Gosh. Oh. Well, it's pioneering it's a wonderful thing to do, and it was exciting to go places where you didn't know the culture of people. We had a wonderful time pioneering. And
how long were you in Morocco?
We were there 6 years, no, 8 years.
That's 7 years more than we were able to stay in Greece.
Yeah.
Because I had received permission from the draft board during the Korean War to go to Greece. That was an extraordinary permission because they had disallowed it 3 times. But the secretary of the draft board finally took it upon herself to authorize me to go. But I had to promise that I would return at the end of a year and go into the army without requesting further deferment for any reason.
Oh,
Now, if I had not made that agreement, I would not have had to go into the army since my wife was pregnant with our son and
yeah.
fathers were exempt from the draft. But since I had made that agreement, I went into the army and served for 2 years.
Well, I would still be living over there if life happened. That I go often, and in fact, this pandemic thing we're going through, I had to cancel. I was scheduled to go back to North Africa to spend time with the friends there. But I can't travel and they haven't opened it so I can go there. But as
Wasn't
soon as
Elsie
we
Austin
can-
there when you were there?
Pardon me?
Wasn't Elsie Austin there when you were there?
Yeah, she was in Tangier.
Oh, I see.
But yes, we were together on the ship. I hadn't even met her when we boarded the ship. We didn't even know she was going to Tangier. We met on the ship, and it was quite a surprise that she would come and visit us, and we would go to Tangier and visit with her too. And it was wonderful. I go and have been going, forever, at least after having to come home, at least every other year, no less than 2 years before going back to be with the community there. It was difficult. And there were prisoners from our Baha'i family there, where we were in. I had the bounty of going to the prison and visit with them.
Well, Carol and I were not very satisfied with what we've been able to accomplish in Greece. But 13 years later, we felt a little better about it when we received an invitation from the Universal House of Justice to return to Greece for the establishment of the National Spiritual Assembly, along with Amin and Sheila Benani, the other Knights of Baha'u'llah for Greece.
Mm.
And when the four of us arrived in Greece, we found that there were now 168 Baha'is in Greece, all but 14 of whom were pioneers from other countries.
Mhm.
So in 13 years, with upwards of 150 Baha'i pioneers to help teach them, only 14 Greeks had become a Baha'i.
Mm.
Now, we then didn't hear anything more from Greece for 50 years. And then in 2017, we saw a report from the Baha'i World News Service about successful mass teaching in Greece. And they reported that one of the Baha'i clusters in Athens had decided to sponsor intensive programs of growth. And at the time of the report, they had 4 IPGs. Each intensive program of growth lasted for 3 months, divided into 3 phases. The first phase was intensive teaching. The second phase was intensive consolidation and study classes. The third phase was reflection meetings and regeneration. Greece had 4 IPGs over the course of a year, and the report said that they had been very successful with many declarations, though no numbers were given. I would love to get an update on that report.
Dr. Allen said that basically every individual, is a racist. And I think the question that he said to pose to someone when we are facing a situation like that is to say, tell me what racist action you saw me do so that I can be aware of it, so that I can learn from it, so I can grow from it. And that's how we make those changes. So I thought that was absolutely wonderful. And that's something that I personally am going to practice. So thank you so much.